March 1945. A narrow street in western Germany. Its stone buildings cracked and blackened by months of air raids. The fighting has just moved on. The sound of artillery has faded eastward, leaving behind a heavy, uncertain quiet. Smoke still drifts from a shattered roof. Broken glass crunches under boots. From cellar doors and doorways, civilians begin to emerge. Women clutch coats too thin for the cold. Elderly men stand rigid, unsure where to look. And children, silent, watchful, peer from behind their mother's legs. They have been told for years what American soldiers are supposed to be like. U.S. infantrymen move slowly through the street. Helmets low, rifles slung, faces tired, hollowed by weeks of fighting. One soldier pauses. He reaches into his pocket, not for ammunition, but for a small, rectangular bar wrapped in brown paper. He kneels, extends his hand. The children hesitate. Then one steps forward. Chocolate. For a moment, no one speaks. The war has not ended yet, but something has already shifted. What unfolds in this brief exchange cannot be understood without looking back at what German civilians had endured and what they had been taught to expect before this day. By the winter of 1944, much of Germany was no longer a functioning nation in conventional sense. It was a landscape shaped by absence of food, of fuel, of safety, of certainty. Years of total war had hollowed out civilian life long before Allied troops crossed the western border. The Allied naval blockade, in place since the early years of the war, had steadily tightened around the Reich. Imports of grain, fats, sugar, and cocoa had collapsed. Civilian ration cards grew thinner each year, their printed promises no longer matched by what could actually be purchased. By late 1944, official rations for civilians often fell well below subsistence levels. In many cities, they existed largely on paper. Bombing accelerated the collapse. The combined bomber offensive had not only targeted factories and rail yards, it shattered urban food distribution itself. Warehouses burned. Markets vanished overnight. Refrigeration failed as electricity grids were destroyed. Families queued for hours only to be told supplies had not arrived. Children learned to stand in line before they learned to read. For German families, especially in the West, survival became a daily calculation. Mothers diluted soups until they were barely warm water. Bread was stretched with fillers, potato peelings, beet pulp, anything available. Meat became a memory. Chocolate, one a modest luxury in pre-war Germany, disappeared entirely. For younger children, it existed only in stories told by parents who spoke of another life. This deprivation was not evenly felt. Nazi officials, party members, and favorite industries were shielded longer. Civilians noticed. Resentment grew, but fear kept it silent. As shortages worsened, the regime leaned harder on propaganda to maintain control. Posters promised final victory. Radio broadcasts blamed shortages on enemy cruelty. Children were told that the hunger they felt was proof of their sacrifice for Germany's future. At the same time, those children were taught to fear what came next. American soldiers, they were warned, were brutal, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. The enemy would not just defeat Germany. They would humiliate it. This message was repeated in classrooms and youth organizations and in newspapers until it became reflex. As Allied forces approached, fear mixed with hunger into something heavier, dread. By early 1945, entire towns lived in basements. Cellars became bedrooms, kitchens, shelters. Families slept fully dressed in case they had to run. Children grew used to the sound of bombs and the taste of ersatz food. Normality narrowed to the smallest routines. So when American units finally crossed into Western Germany, they did not enter a defiant population. They entered a society already exhausted, already stripped bare, already bracing for something worse. And it was into this fragile, starving world that the U.S. Army arrived, bringing with it not just rifles and tanks, but an industrial system Germany could no longer imagine. The American soldiers who crossed the German border in late 1944 and early 1945 arrived as the visible edge of a vast, disciplined system. Behind every infantryman moving cautiously through a ruined town stood an industrial and logistical network unlike anything the world had seen. By the time U.S. forces reached the Rhine, American factories were producing at a scale that dwarfed Axis output. Food production alone exceeded military needs. The United States had not fought the war under blockade or scarcity. Its farms expanded. Its supply lines stretched across oceans and remained intact. What reached the front lines was not just ammunition and fuel, but consistency, regular meals, standardized rations, and predictable resupply. Each American soldier carried rations designed for endurance. The K-ration, intended for short-term combat use, included items meant to sustain both body and morale: biscuits, canned meat, powdered beverages, and small chocolate bars. The D-ration, a dense emergency chocolate bar developed before the war, was designed to survive heat and handling. It was intentionally unappetizing when consumed quickly, but to someone who had not seen chocolate in years, it was unmistakable. These rations were not luxuries. They were calculated components of modern warfare. American planners understood that a fed soldier fought better, endured longer, and recovered faster. Even during intense fighting in the Ardennes or along the Rhine, U.S. units expected to eat daily. Interruptions were considered failures, not inevitabilities. This abundance shaped behavior. By 1945, many American soldiers had been in Europe for months. They had marched through France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They had seen liberated populations react with relief and gratitude. They had also witnessed devastation, starvation, and displacement. By the time they entered Germany itself, they were not arriving blind to civilian suffering. At the same time, the U.S. Army enforced strict discipline. Orders governing contact with civilians were clear. Soldiers were warned against looting, fraternization, or revenge. Violations were punished. Commanders understood that the occupation of Germany would not be judged only by military success, but by conduct. Yet within those rules, moments emerged that no regulation could fully anticipate. A soldier handing food to a child was not part of a strategic directive. It was an instinct shaped by contrast. American troops could see the difference immediately. Their own packs full, civilian cupboards empty. For German civilians watching these columns pass, the shock was immediate. The enemy did not look like the figures from propaganda posters. The Americans were calm, organized, well-fed. Their uniforms were worn but intact. Their trucks kept arriving. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. And soon, in streets and courtyards across Western Germany, that imbalance would reveal itself not through violence, but through a simple, unexpected gesture that carried far more weight than anyone anticipated. Angle 1. The child perspective. For German children in the spring of 1945, the war had never been an abstract concept. It was a physical presence, felt in hunger, in cold, in fear. Many had spent years measuring time by air raid sirens and ration days. Their world had grown smaller with each month, shrinking to basements, queues, and whispered conversations among adults. When American soldiers entered their towns, children were often the first to see them. They watched from behind broken walls or door frames, absorbing every detail. The soldiers did not shout. They did not fire. They moved deliberately, scanning corners, speaking in unfamiliar accents. For children raised on warnings of brutality, the sight alone was confusing. Then came the chocolate. A small bar held out silently. No demands. No exchange. Some children did not recognize it at first. Others did, but hesitated, unsure whether touching it was allowed. Parents froze, caught between fear and disbelief. For those who accepted, the experience was overwhelming. The taste was intense, unfamiliar, almost shocking. It was not just sweetness. It was density, richness, something their bodies had not known in years. For many, it became a permanent memory, recalled decades later with clarity, not because it was candy, but because it represented the end of deprivation. In that moment, the war shifted shape. The enemy became human. Angle 2, the American soldier's state of mind. The soldiers offering those chocolate bars were not untouched by the war. Most had marched through mud and snow. They had lost friends. They had seen burned villages and bodies left where they fell. By 1945, exhaustion was visible in their posture and faces. Handing food to children was not a calculated act of kindness. It came from a collision of realities. American soldiers were carrying more than they needed. German children had almost nothing. The contrast was immediate and uncomfortable. For many soldiers, it also felt like closure. The fighting was still ongoing, but the purpose of it, ending a system that had consumed entire societies, suddenly had a face. Offering food was not forgiveness. It was relief, a sign that the worst might be ending. Angle 3. Logistics as silent power. What made these moments possible was not sentiment, but structure. The U.S. Army's logistical reach allowed generosity to occur without weakening combat effectiveness. A single chocolate bar could be spared because another truck was already en route. To German civilians, this was incomprehensible. Scarcity had defined their lives for years. The idea that an army could feed itself and still have excess undermined years of propaganda in seconds. This was power expressed quietly. No speeches, no banners, just proof. And as these encounters multiplied, their meaning deepened, reaching beyond individual streets and into the wider collapse of belief that sustained the war itself. Angle 4. The collapse of propaganda. For years, the Nazi regime had worked carefully to define the image of the American soldier. He was portrayed as undisciplined, violent, and morally corrupt, dangerous not just because he carried a weapon, but because he threatened German identity itself. This image was repeated until it became instinctive, especially among children. The reality encountered in 1945 unraveled that construction with startling speed. American troops followed orders. They posted guards. They controlled movement. They did not burn homes or seize food at gunpoint. In many towns, they did the opposite, sharing what they carried, often quietly without announcement. When a child accepted chocolate from an American soldier, propaganda did not simply weaken. It failed. No counter-argument could survive such a direct contradiction. The regime had promised cruelty. What appeared instead was restraint. This moment mattered because propaganda relies on distance. Once the enemy becomes present and behaves differently than promised, the illusion collapses. For German civilians, especially the young, this was the first crack in a worldview built under total control. Angle 5. Moral authority without words. The U.S. Army did not enter Germany as a humanitarian organization. Its purpose was to defeat the enemy completely. Yet in victory, behavior mattered. Officers understood that how soldiers acted would shape the peace to come. Moral authority is rarely declared. It is demonstrated. In these brief exchanges, American soldiers displayed a confidence that did not require cruelty. They did not need to intimidate civilians already defeated by circumstance. A chocolate bar, insignificant in military terms, carried symbolic weight. It showed that power could be exercised without humiliation. That restraint was a choice, not a limitation. Angle 6. Leadership and discipline. Behind these individual acts stood a framework of command. American leadership emphasized control over emotion. Revenge killings, looting, and abuse were treated as failures of discipline, not understandable reactions. This mattered. German civilians noticed patterns quickly. Soldiers rotated through towns, but behavior remained consistent. The rules held. The order did not collapse. By the time these encounters became routine, something deeper had shifted. The war's final phase was no longer defined only by battles and surrender lines, but by the quiet transfer of authority from one system to another. That transfer would soon reach its breaking point, when the fighting itself came to an end.